Director of Financial Regulatory Studies at the Cato Institute. He testifies before Congress on these issues, and he's testified on this issue of housing, the housing crisis. Mark Calabria, great to be back with you.
Well, it's great to be here, Craig, and I very much appreciate the very kind words.
It's true. It's just I wish you would have posted some more on this because I know you're busy. I know you've posted it before. You got a great primer paper on how to fix the housing mess. But that even makes it harder on people like me who need to do show prep and rely on you. So, yes, nice way of saying, hey, love your work. Tell me what happened today.
Well, thank you. And part of the problem is that we're really short on details. And the AGs and the Justice Department have really only released about a two-pager, a very headline things. So a lot of the questions, and I'll go back and reiterate what you said, which is, we have a headline number of about $25, $26 billion is the total cost of this. Now, there are very different pieces of this. Now, some of this is going to be money that's going to go to the states. About $5 billion of this is going to be payments that are going to go to the states. And, of course, the states have told us that they're going to use it for consumer protection. And, of course, we can remember that the states told us they were going to use tobacco money for all sorts of nice things and instead used it essentially as a slush fund. So I'm very skeptical about what's going to happen with that. There's about another $1.5 billion of this that's supposed to go to nonprofits. And again, I think there's a very good likelihood that this will certainly just go to whatever the incarnation of Acorn is it is around now. But about $18 billion of this is supposed to go to homeowners. Now, it should be clear that not all of this is going to come from the banks. Much of this is going to actually come from the investor. Those people who hold mortgage-backed securities, those people who've invested mortgages. This is often, quite often pension funds, retirement funds. I've seen some estimates that say that only about $5 billion of this is actually going to come from the banks themselves. So, again, it looks like that the agreement between the President Obama and the state AGs and the banks will push much of the losses to somebody else. Whoever, I guess it's the old quip that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so much of this will essentially be borne by others. But even in terms of whether this helps homeowners is not clear at this case. For instance, there is going to be money that's going to be put aside for homeowners who have been foreclosed upon, and the agreement is clear that you don't necessarily have to have been harmed. And so only because this is less than $2 billion that's going to help homeowners who have been foreclosed, it really looks like to me more a lottery than anything else. So to me, a very basic concept of justice should be, those who are harmed are the ones that are compensated, and those who did the harm are the ones who pay the cost. And I would say that both of those principles are violated in this agreement.
And the people that get hurt are the investors, and as you mentioned, some of those investors are people relying on those investments and interest on those investments for their retirement funds, which you actually talked about in another piece earlier this week. Let me ask you this, though. What was the premise? Did the Department of Justice say, the Attorney General Holder say, hey, look, you all took advantage of the consumer, and through robo-signing, we may not think, it may just be sloppy, it may not be fraudulent, you foreclosed on people that we feel bad for and we want to reward. So rather than deal with the government, which power is unlimited, we want you to settle up for $26 billion. Is that what went down there?
That's largely the case. And I would say to the extent that anybody has harmed anybody, this should really be something that's determined by the courts. I mean, we actually have three branches of government at the federal level. I know the president sometimes forgets that. And, the branch of government that settles disputes between private parties, such as banks and borrowers, is called the judicial system. It's called the courts. Now, fortunately, a federal judge has to sign off on this agreement, and so I really hope that this is an opportunity where a federal judge decides to do his job and says, where is the evidence? Who has been harmed? Where is the evidence that the money goes to help those who've been harmed rather than goes into a big slush fund and doesn't help those who were harmed? So, again, I have a problem with this in the sense that it really allows the executive branch, the president, to play, judge, jury, and executioner. And that's quite frankly not how our system is set up. Our separation of powers is incredibly vital to protecting liberty, in my opinion. And one of the core insights, I think, of our founding fathers in terms of diffusing power. And so, again, this is an agreement that, in my opinion, has been cut in a back room. And again, if banks are at fault, if individuals have committed crimes, they should pay, and those crimes should be determined in a court. And they should be determined in open court where we can all see some of the evidence.
We saw an element of this with the Chrysler bondholders? I mean, isn't it akin to this kind of bullying?
Absolutely. That's a terrific analogy, because you may remember that there was a big pension funds in Indiana, and these were government employees. These were state government employees, had pension funds that held a lot of GM debt. And what happened was the UAW, the auto workers, got placed in front of these pension fund holders. And so we get the reverse order in terms of basically picking, rather than what you agreed to ahead of time in terms of who has what place in line, politics determine whose place is in line. And this is the same actually with this agreement. What we're hearing is that any reductions on first mortgages will also be imposed a similar level of reduction on second mortgages. So for instance, if the first mortgage gets reduced by 10%, the second mortgage gets reduced by 10%. But that absolutely is contradictory to how bankruptcy law is supposed to work, for instance. In bankruptcy law, the second mortgage is supposed to be completely wiped out before the first mortgage takes a hit. Now, that's not surprising in this case, because guess what? It's the investors who hold the first mortgages and the banks who hold the second mortgages. So again, to some extent, I think this agreement is abusive of banks, but even more so, it's an agreement between the banks and the Obama administration to stick it to the investors, which I think is the real problem here, particularly because we need private capital back in our mortgage market. I mean, as you know, about 90+% of new mortgages are guaranteed by the taxpayer in one way or another, and we're never going to get the mortgage market off the back of the taxpayer if we continue to impose losses on investors who have done nothing to get those losses, who've done nothing to deserve those losses. There's just so much political risk in terms of investing in the mortgage market today that I don't know why anybody in their right mind would invest their money in mortgages.
What does that mean for people desiring to own a home and do it the right way who've been responsible?
It means that the rest of us are likely going to pay higher costs. It also means that the losses from the mortgage market will ultimately be put back on the rest of us via the taxpayer, so that these aren't being allocated to people who willingly took that risk and priced that risk. And of course, because that risk is not being accurately priced, you're going to get decision making in the financial markets distorted. I mean, the primary reason, to oversimplify the reason why you had a financial crisis, was because risk was grossly mispriced. And of course, for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons was various government guarantees and incentives and distortions in the market, which really pushed people into making bad decisions. And this is on the part of the banks, on the part of homeowners, on the part of borrowers, the part of investors, really all had their prices distorted. I can't overemphasize the key importance of having an accurate, an unbiased price system in the allocation of resources. If you don't have that and you have the government come in and manipulate that, we all end up making bad decisions. And we're in this same environment. So I fear, again, that we're going down the path of probably having another bailout in the mortgage market that's ultimately going to be picked up by the taxpayer. And so we learned all the wrong lessons from this crisis.
And what you just mentioned with the distortion and actually the attempt to find a price, the artificial element of it by the government trying to manipulate, that transcends different industries like
Absolutely.
healthcare, education, and everything else. So when we continue to try to manipulate, distort, get in between the consumer and the provider, bottom line, we're going to have problems. You just said that there may be another bailout. What do you think the chances are of another bailout here?
Well, let's
Mark?
start with certain parts of the mortgage market. I mean, for instance, we have FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, is within the next 5 to 6 years, we will probably put somewhere between $5 and $50 billion into the Federal Housing Administration. It ended up taking all the risk off the banking sector for the mortgage market after the bubble burst, and really was tried to use as a prop to recreate the bubble. Those losses are certainly going to come home to roost sooner rather than later. And again, the next time we see the cycle go again, because we have a housing boom and bust in this country every 10 to 15, 20 years. We have not ended the business cycle. We have not ended the housing cycle. These things are going to come back to haunt us again. And we raise the likelihood that we will never get rid of Freddie and Fannie and we'll never get the taxpayer out of this if we continue to essentially tack private capital, if we essentially continue to force the investors to take losses when they did not agree to those losses, when they weren't necessarily the wrongdoing. Again, I would go back to the extent to which anybody committed crimes, it should be the parties that committed those crimes that are held responsible, not the investors who were not party to that.
Yes. Mark Calabria, making time for us tonight. Thank you. Great to be with you. Take care.